He firmly held her waist, pulling her close to himself. "Don't resist me. This is a way to release God's blessing over your life," Daddy Possibilities said to Deborah during a special prayer. "I've always believed in praying to God on my own, but my mother had a different opinion." To her, Pastor Benjamin aka Daddy Possibilities was the voice of God on earth, and she trusted him completely, dragging me to his church for prayers and prophecies. When I expressed my desire to pray independently, she called me stubborn and insisted I meet him for a special prayer. I didn't want to, but I obeyed her. That day, everything changed. This is a story of many young girls. House of Eternal Possibilities Church of God stood tall. It wasn't merely a place of worship, but a landmark. Crowds filled the pews every Sunday, eager to catch a glimpse of Daddy Possibilities, Pastor Benjamin Adetla. He was not an ordinary preacher. With his designer suits, polished shoes, and a convoy of luxury cars, he was as much a celebrity as he was a man of God. Women adored him, calling him Daddy with respect. They would whisper about his anointing, giving him more respect than they offered to their husbands. Men too bowed to him, seeking his guidance for their businesses and families. Pastor Benjamin had a reputation for solving problems, particularly for those who could pay the price. The church auditorium buzzed with excitement as the choir belted out powerful tunes. Daddy Possibilities walked in, his presence commanding attention. He mounted the altar, gripping the microphone tightly. "Today," he announced, "God is about to do something miraculous. Your lives will never remain the same." The congregation erupted in cheers. The congregation at House of Eternal Possibilities was as lively as ever. The choir had just finished their electrifying ministration. When Mrs. Rachel approached Daddy Possibilities after the service, her 16-year-old teenage daughter Deborah stood beside her, nervously clutching her handbag. "Daddy, please, I need you to pray for my daughter," Mrs. Rachel began. "She has just finished her WAEC and is trusting God for admission into the university." Possibility smiled warmly, his charismatic demeanor drawing them in. My daughter," he said, turning to Deborah, "God has great plans for you. Come forward." Deborah stepped forward hesitantly. Daddy Possibilities placed his hand on her head, muttering a string of prayers. After the prayer, Daddy Possibilities straightened up and spoke directly to Deborah. "Come back later, my daughter. There's a special prayer I need to do for your breakthrough. God is about to open doors for you." Mrs. Rachel beamed with gratitude. "Thank you, Daddy. We will be here." That evening at home, Deborah remained still in the corner of the living room while her mother made dinner. The occurrences of the day burdened her thoughts. "Mummy," she started slowly, "I don't think I should return to Daddy Possibilities for the prayer. I want to pray by myself. God will still hear me." Mrs. Rachel paused chopping vegetables and turned to look at her daughter, her expression serious. "What nonsense are you talking, Deborah? Do you believe you understand God better than Daddy Possibilities? He's a man of God. His prayers operate quicker and more effectively." "But Mummy," Deborah sought to clarify, "I trust God will listen to me if I pray genuinely from my heart." Mrs. Rachel waved her hand dismissively. "You're just being obstinate. You teenagers presume to know everything. Tomorrow you will return to Daddy Possibilities for the prayer, and that decision is final." Deborah sighed, realizing there was no use in arguing further. She quietly went back to her room, her heart laden with discomfort. The following day Deborah went back to the church as her mother instructed. She was welcomed by one of the ushers who took her to Daddy Possibilities' office. "Ah, my daughter, welcome," Daddy Possibilities said, rising from his comfortable chair. His smile was broad, yet there was something unsettling in his gaze that Deborah couldn't quite identify. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Deborah sat, anxiously gripping her bag tightly. "God revealed something to me about you." Daddy Possibilities started. "Your future is very promising, but there are forces attempting to hinder you. That's why I need to pray for you in a special manner." Deborah nodded, uncertain of how to respond. "Come closer," he commanded. Hesitantly Deborah stood and approached his desk. What transpired next would alter her life forever. Daddy Possibilities' demeanor changed. His voice, once gentle, became authoritative. He reached for her, and before Deborah could understand what was unfolding, he had his way with her. When it concluded, he straightened his tie, his expression tranquil as if nothing had occurred. Deborah, on the other hand, was trembling, tears flowing down her face. "Listen to me," Daddy Possibilities stated firmly. "You must never disclose this to anyone. If you do, you will invite a curse upon yourself and your family. Do you comprehend? Deborah nodded vacantly, her voice trapped in her throat. She staggered out of the office, her mind whirling. When Deborah returned home, she appeared a mere shadow of her former self. Her mother recognized her silence but dismissed it as typical teenage moodiness. "Deborah, how was the prayer session?" Mrs. Rachel inquired casually while peeling yams. Deborah faltered, her lips quivering. "Mama, something occurred." Mrs. Rachel briefly looked at her daughter. "What happened? Speak up." Deborah attempted to articulate her thoughts. "Mama, I don't believe Daddy Possibilities is what he appears to be." Before she could complete her statement, Mrs. Rachel forcefully struck her knife on the cutting board. "Hey, Deborah, what are you attempting to convey? Are you suggesting that a whole man of God is not authentic? Are you trying to invoke a curse upon this household?" "Mama, please just hear me out," Deborah implored. He did something to me." "Keep quiet," her mother shouted, her voice filled with anger. "I don't want to hear any more of this nonsense. You just don't like church, that's why you're saying all these things. You're too young to understand spiritual matters. Go to your room and stop nagging me." Deborah's heart sank. She wanted to scream, to cry, to make her mother see the truth, but Mrs. Rachel had already dismissed her, turning her focus back to her cooking. During the service the following Sunday, Pastor Benjamin's prophetic powers were fully evident. He scanned the congregation as if searching for someone in particular. Suddenly, his gaze landed on a young woman sitting quietly in the middle row. "You, the sister in the yellow dress, stand up." The woman, clearly nervous, rose to her feet. "Yes, Daddy. What's your name?" "My name is Hope, sir," she replied, her voice shaking. "Daddy Possibilities began, the Lord is showing me something about your life. You've been struggling with relationships, am I correct?" Hope's eyes widened in disbelief. "Yes, Daddy, it's true. You've been praying for a husband, but nothing is working. Am I speaking the truth?" "Yes, Daddy, it's true." Hope's voice cracked as tears streamed down her face. Hope walked to the altar where Daddy Possibilities placed his hand on her head. "I break every yoke of delay in your life. Your husband will find you. After this service, come and see me in my office. There is a special prayer I need to do for you." The congregation erupted in applause as Hope knelt down, feeling overwhelmed. Later in the service, Daddy Possibilities directed his attention to a sophisticated-looking woman, seated at the front. She was Mrs. Adola, the wife of a prosperous businessman, known for her wealth and always dressed in the finest attire. "You, my daughter, Mrs. Adola, stand up." She rose gracefully, a curious smile lighting up her face. "Yes, Daddy, the Lord is revealing something to me about your marriage." Daddy Possibilities stated, his tone serious, "There is trouble in your home, your husband has not been faithful." Mrs. Adiola's expression changed, her smile disappearing. "Daddy, is that true?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes, my daughter," Daddy Possibilities replied, "but don't worry, God will fight for you. After the service, come to my office for counseling." The congregation murmured, impressed by Daddy Possibilities' ability to see what others could not. After the service, a line of people formed outside Daddy Possibilities' lavish office, which was adorned with gold-plated furniture and framed photographs of him with dignitaries. Hope was the first to be called in. She sat nervously across from him, clutching her handbag. "My daughter," Daddy Possibilities began, "you are special. That is why the enemy has been fighting your relationships. But don't worry, I will personally pray for you. Sow a seed of faith and your breakthrough will come." "Thank you, Daddy," Hope said, reaching into her bag to hand over an envelope of cash. Next Mrs. Adola entered, Daddy Possibilities, who welcomed her warmly. "My daughter, the enemy seeks to destroy your home, but through prayer we will prevail," he said. "Thank you, Daddy," she replied, tears in her eyes. Before she departed, Daddy Possibilities handed her a bottle of anointed oil. "Use this to anoint your house and remember to continue supporting the work of God with your resources on Sundays." Daddy Possibilities always concluded his sermons with a message about wealth and success. "God desires his children to prosper," he proclaimed from the altar. "Look at me, I am a living testament. Sow into this ministry and you too will prosper." The congregation cheered, many rushing to the altar to deposit money at his feet. What the congregation didn't realize was that Daddy Possibilities was no longer the humble pastor he used to be. His focus had shifted from saving souls to building his empire. Women flocked to him, and he relished the control he wielded over their lives. Weeks morphed into months, and Deborah found herself ensnared in a cycle from which she couldn't escape. Each time she was called to Daddy Possibilities' office, her fear intensified, but she felt powerless to resist. At home, she attempted numerous times to speak to her mother, but Mrs. Rachel's unwavering faith in Daddy Possibilities rendered it impossible. Deborah, her mother would say, if you don't desire God's blessings, just say so, stop speaking nonsense about a man of God. Deborah ceased her attempts, she buried her anguish deep within her. Her once bright eyes now dull with sadness. One Sunday, after yet another encounter with Daddy Possibilities, Deborah returned home and locked herself in her room. She gazed at the mirror, barely recognizing the figure reflected back at her. She sat down and began to write in her journal, expressing her feelings in words she couldn't articulate aloud. Another Sunday at House of Eternal Possibilities was brimming with energy as usual. The choir sang passionately, the congregation clapped and danced, and Daddy Possibilities stood tall on the altar, delivering a sermon about divine favor. His words enthralled the crowd, and after the service, a line of people formed outside his office seeking special prayers and counsel. Among them was Mrs. James, a respected church member, accompanied by her daughter. Feen was a bright, ambitious 17-year-old girl preparing to travel abroad for her studies. She had been processing her visa for weeks, and Mrs. James believed Daddy Possibilities' prayers would ensure everything proceeded smoothly. "Ah, my daughter Feen, God has wonderful plans for you, let us pray." He placed his hand on Feen's head and started to pray earnestly, calling upon blessings and favor. Mrs. James, moved by the prayer, knelt beside her daughter with tears in her eyes. When the prayer concluded, Daddy Possibilities turned to Feen, saying, "My daughter, there is another matter we need to discuss. God has revealed to me that there are forces attempting to hinder your success. Come back later in the week for a special prayer, and we will address it." Mrs. James nodded eagerly and replied, "Thank you, Daddy, we'll be here." True to her mother's instructions, Feen returned to the church a few days later. She felt nervous but reassured herself that it was merely another prayer session. One of the ushers guided her into Daddy Possibilities' office. "Ah, my daughter, welcome," he greeted, his voice warm and welcoming. "Are you prepared for your breakthrough?" "Yes, sir," Feen replied, forcing a smile. "Good, sit down," he instructed, gesturing to the chair across from him. Feen sat down, gripping her bag tightly. Daddy Possibilities began to speak in a low tone, explaining the spiritual battles she was facing and how his prayers would ensure the success of her visa process. "Stand up," he suddenly said. Feen rose, confused but compliant. He moved closer, placing his hands on her shoulders while muttering a prayer. Then, without warning, his demeanor changed. He reached for her waist, pulling her closer to himself, making his intentions evident. "Daddy, what are you doing?" Feen inquired as she attempted to pull away. "Sure," he whispered, tightening his grip. "This is for your breakthrough, don't resist God's work." Before Feen could protest any further, he took advantage of her. When it was over, she sat in shock, tears streaming down her face. "Listen to me," Daddy Possibilities said, adjusting his tie. "You must never tell anyone about this. I have just released blessings upon your life, and believe me, your visa application will be successful if you follow my instructions. However, if you don't, you will bring a curse upon yourself and your family. Do you understand?" Feen nodded numbly, unable to articulate her thoughts. Just as she was getting dressed, the office door swung open. Standing in the doorway was Mrs. Adetola, Daddy Possibilities' wife. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene, the disheveled look on Feen's face and the guilt etched across her husband's expression. "Benjamin, what is happening here?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "My darling, it's not what it looks like," Daddy Possibilities stammered, his once confident demeanor replaced by panic. "Not what it looks like," she repeated, her voice rising. "I just walked in on you with a young girl in the house of God." Feen, still trembling, attempted to slip past Mrs. Adetola, But the older woman halted her. "Wait, my dear, are you okay? What happened?" Before Fiend could reply, Daddy Possibilities entered, saying, "My darling, please let her go. I'll explain everything." Mrs. Adetula hesitated, her expression a blend of confusion and anger. At last, she stepped aside, and Fiend hurried out of the office. As soon as the door was closed, Mrs. Adetula turned to her husband. "What have you done, Benjamin? Do you realize the damage this could cause, the shame it would bring to this church, to our family?" Daddy Possibilities sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. "It was the devil, my darling. I don't know what came over me. Please forgive me, and you must never speak of this to anyone." Mrs. Adetula's eyes brimmed with tears. "You expect me to stay quiet after what I just saw? This is a disgrace. My darling, please," he pleaded, reaching for her hand. "If this gets out, it will destroy everything we've built. Think of the church, the congregation, they need me." Mrs. Adetula pulled her hand away, her face marked by disappointment. "Benjamin, this is not the man I married. I don't even recognize you anymore. It was a mistake," he insisted. "I will pray for forgiveness, and I know God will forgive me, but you must help me keep this a secret." After a long pause, Mrs. Adetula nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but this can never happen again. If I find out you've done this to another girl, I will not stay silent." "Thank you, my darling," he said, breathing a sigh of relief. Despite the tension in their home, life at House of Eternal Possibilities went on as usual. Daddy Possibilities preached with the same fervor, his voice resonating through the microphone as he talked about prosperity and blessings, while the congregation remained unaware of the shadows lurking behind the scenes. Women still came to his office for prayers, men continued to seek his counsel, and donations kept flowing in. For Fiend, however, life was anything but normal. She struggled to make sense of what had occurred, her once bright spirit now burdened by shame and confusion. She evaded her mother's inquiries, fearing the repercussions of speaking out. Meanwhile, Mrs. Adetula observed her husband closely, her trust in him shattered. Although she kept his secret, her heart was heavy with guilt and resentment. Daddy Possibilities, on the other hand, seemed unaffected. He convinced himself that he had been forgiven, that he could proceed with his ministry as long as he remained cautious. Yet, deep down, he understood that the facade he had constructed was gradually disintegrating, and it was only a matter of time until the truth emerged. The gentle buzz of the kettle resonated through the kitchen, as Mr. Dele Obafemi straightened his tie in the living room mirror. He took a moment to look at his wife Tola, who was actively preparing their 2 children for Sunday service at House of Eternal Possibilities. Dele inhaled deeply, pausing before addressing Tola. He spoke softly, stating that there was something he had been wanting to discuss with her. Tola halted, brushing lint off their son's pants, asking him what it was. Dele commenced, sitting down and loosening his tie, explaining that lately he had been feeling distanced from the church. Within his spirit, he lacked a spiritual connection to House of Eternal Possibilities, feeling that something was off. Tola straightened, her face reflecting both curiosity and concern, remarking that it was disconnected and questioning what he meant by it. She asserted that Daddy Possibilities is a true man of God, whose prayers have transformed lives. She reminded him of when he prayed for their business, and how things turned around almost instantly. Dele nodded slowly but continued, acknowledging her point while emphasizing the importance of discernment. He cited the Bible verse from 1 John 4 vs 1, which advises not to believe every spirit but to test them, due to the existence of numerous false prophets. He expressed that they needed to examine the spirit behind this church, clarifying that he wasn't accusing Daddy of being a false prophet, but they should not disregard their feelings. Tola sighed, her voice softening as she responded that she understood him, yet highlighted his skeptical nature. She reassured him that Daddy Possibilities had never given them cause to doubt him, noting his help to so many people, suggesting this might just be a phase. Dele leaned back, scrutinizing her. He remarked on her immense respect for Daddy Possibilities, with a wry smile, stating that he wasn't sure he had ever heard her speak so highly of him, leading Tola to chuckle lightly and dismiss him. She told him to stop and not to be envious of a man of God. Dele laughed but stayed pensive. He reiterated seriously that they should remain vigilant, emphasizing the idea that not everything that glitters is gold. Tola gave him a comforting pat on the shoulder, before refocusing on the children. She urged Dele not to let them be late for church, and their discussion concluded there, yet Dele's unease persisted as they got into the car and drove to church. The church was bustling that morning, just like every Sunday, with individuals from various backgrounds flocking to the building, eager to hear Daddy Possibilities preach and receive their miracles. The choir energized the atmosphere with a spirited session of praise and worship, their voices resonating throughout the room. Soon, Daddy Possibilities took the stage, his voice powerful as he shared his sermon on divine breakthrough. The congregation was engrossed, nodding and shouting Amen, in response to his declaration that God was present in that place. He proclaimed that today, God would reveal himself to them in unimaginable ways as the service continued. Daddy Possibilities began his prophetic session. He maneuvered through the crowd, calling out individuals by name and disclosing personal details about their lives. "You there," he pointed to a young woman in the audience, "your name is Kimi, and you've been crying yourself to sleep because of a failed relationship. God says he will restore your joy." The woman gasped, her hands covering her mouth in astonishment, while the congregation erupted in applause, marveling at the precision of the prophecy. Next, he addressed an elderly man, "Baba, you've been suffering from chest pain for months. God says you are healed." The man shook his head, then fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. It's true," he exclaimed. Dele remained seated, observing the spectacle with a blend of skepticism and discomfort. Tola, on the other hand, was completely captivated, occasionally nudging Dele and whispering, "See how God is using him, isn't it amazing?" Dele forced a smile but remained silent, the words from 1 John 4:1 reverberating in his mind. Meanwhile, in another section of the church, Deborah sat quietly next to her mother, Mrs. Rachel, feeling a heavy heart and a mind clouded with despair. Every Sunday was becoming increasingly challenging for her to tolerate. She glanced at her mother, who was singing and clapping enthusiastically, entirely engaged in the service. Deborah wished to tell her everything, to finally disclose the horrible secret she had been harboring, but each time she attempted to speak, her mother brushed her off, unwilling to entertain any negativity about Daddy Possibilities. Deborah's thoughts wandered back to the numerous occasions she had been called to his office under the pretense of special prayers. The pain, the shame, and the fear still haunted her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to make someone listen, but who would believe her? Her eyes scanned the congregation. Everyone adored Daddy Possibilities. He was untouchable, venerated like a saint. She felt imprisoned in a reality where her voice held no significance. During the prophetic session, Daddy Possibilities called out another woman from the crowd, providing a detailed prophecy regarding her troubled marriage. The woman dissolved into tears, affirming everything he articulated. The crowd erupted, praising God for utilizing Daddy Possibilities so mightily. Deborah felt a surge of anger intertwined with despair. How can they not see the truth? She thought bitterly. How can they not see what he truly is? As the service progressed, Deborah struggled to contain her tears. She bowed her head, silently praying for strength. If no one else would listen, perhaps God would. Back in their seats, Dele observed Deborah's demeanor. She appeared withdrawn, her shoulders slumped, and her gaze fixated on the floor. "Tola," he whispered to his wife, "look at that girl over there, she doesn't seem okay." Tola followed his gaze and spotted Deborah. "Oh, that's Mrs. Rachel's daughter, maybe she's just shy." "What's your point, Dele?" "I don't know," Dele admitted, "I just feel like something isn't right." Tola shook her head, brushing aside his worries. "Dele, you're overanalyzing everything, let's concentrate on the service." Dele sighed as he leaned back in his chair, the sensation of discomfort lingering more intensely than ever. The service had concluded, and the church had emptied as families made their way back to their homes. At the Obafemi household, Dele and Tola talked about the day's sermon while their children played nearby. Meanwhile, at the Rachel residence, a heavy silence enveloped the house. Deborah had withdrawn to her room right after they arrived, her heart laden and her spirit shattered. In the dimly lit corner of her room, Deborah sat cross-legged on the floor, holding a worn diary that had become her private confidant, the sole outlet for her pain. She turned its pages, her eyes scanning the words she had penned throughout the months. I trust him. Why would God permit this to happen? No one believes me. Even Mama thinks I'm lying. How long will this continue? I can't endure it any longer. Tears blurred her vision as she clutched the pen tightly, her hand shaking as she wrote, "To anyone who finds this, I want you to understand the truth. Daddy Possibilities is not who he claims to be. He has caused me more harm than I can withstand, and I cannot continue living like this." Her sobs filled the still room as she shut the diary and set it down. She reached beneath her bed and retrieved a small bottle of pills she had taken from her mother's cabinet. With unsteady hands, she removed the cap, poured the contents into her palm, and stared at them momentarily. "This is the only way," she whispered to herself, swallowing the pills in one swift gulp. She lay back on her bed, clutching the diary to her heart as her tears gradually dried. Within minutes, her breathing became shallow, and her eyes shut. It wasn't until the evening that Mrs. Rachel sensed something was wrong. Deborah had not emerged from her room for dinner, and the house felt eerily quiet. Initially, she presumed her daughter was sulking, as she often did after disagreements about church matters. "Deborah," Rachel called, knocking on the door, "come and eat. You can't stay in there all day." When there was no reply, her heart began to race. She pushed the door open and froze at the sight before her. Deborah lay still on the bed, her face ashen, and her hands tightly gripping the diary. The empty pill bottle lay abandoned on the floor. "Oh no, 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 no!" Rachel screamed, rushing to her daughter's side. She shook her, hoping against hope that she would awaken. "Deborah, wake up, please, baby, wake up." But Deborah did not stir. Rachel's hands trembled as she reached for the diary. She opened it and began reading, her eyes widening with each line. Her breath caught in her throat as the full impact of the truth came crashing down on her. Daddy Possibilities, the prayers, the office visits, the cautions to remain silent. Rachel covered her mouth with her hands as a guttural cry broke free. "How could I have been so blind?" she whispered, tears flowing down her cheeks. "My own daughter. I didn't listen. I failed her." Her anguish morphed into despair while she looked at the diary on the floor, which held the damning truth. But what could she do with it? Who would believe her? Daddy Possibilities was admired by everyone, including herself. It's not that her possibilities were in any way alarming. "If I tell anyone, they'll say I'm lying," she muttered to herself. "They'll say Deborah hated the church and fabricated all this. They'll label me a resentful woman attempting to ruin a man of God." Her mind raced with conflicted feelings. On one hand, she sought justice for Deborah, yet on the other, she dreaded the backlash and the disgrace it would bring to her family. On the third day, she began to see beginnings as she held Deborah's lifeless body, swaying back and forth with sobs shaking her body. "I'm so sorry, my child. I should have listened. I should have protected you." Rachel resolved that night. She cleaned the area, erasing any trace that could connect Deborah's death to Daddy Possibilities. She stashed the diary in a drawer, locking it and concealing the key. When neighbors came the following day to offer condolences, she informed them that it was a tragic accident, that Deborah had been chosen by evil spirits to take her own life. The church organized a small service for Deborah, during which Daddy Possibilities shared words of consolation. "The devil works in mysterious ways, but we must remain steadfast in our faith," he stated, his voice grave. Rachel watched him from her seat, her heart heavy with rage and grief. She longed to shout the truth to the congregation to reveal the man they all revered, but she stayed silent, her sorrow a weight she would bear alone. Watch out for part 2. Please subscribe, like, and comment, it goes a long way. To be continued.